Salutare, salutare! Astăzi ne vom uita la Judge Napolitano, Andrew Napolitano. Unii dintre voi îl știți de pe vremea când lucra la Fox News. Iar invitatul lui Judge Napolitano este Max Blumenthal, un jurnalist foarte respectat. Eu am luat contact prima oară cu munca lui Blumenthal atunci când acesta a ținut un discurs la ONU, discurs în cadrul căruia expunea crimele de război care se petreceau în Ucraina. Da? V-am auzit deja crimele de război comise de Putin. Nu. Crimele de război comise de Ucraina. Asta expunea Max Blumenthal, deci este un jurnalist dintr-o bucată de partea corectă a istoriei și de partea adevărată a adevărului, dacă mi se permite această exprimare. Hai să vedem ce are de zis despre situația din Gaza. Vă anunț de pe acum că unele detalii vor fi șocante, deci dacă aveți copii pe lângă dumneavoastră, mai bine îi trimiteți la culcare, iar când nu voi mai putea, eu voi opri filmarea și voi lăsa linkul acestui videoclip în descriere pentru a continua voi vizionarea pe cont propriu. Go!
You are a world-renowned investigative journalist, and your investigative work of late has centered around the horrors in Gaza.
Da, deci ăsta este jurnalist, nu este un fel de bot, da?
And the crimes committed by the Israeli Defense Forces. One of the issues that you have recently raised is this: have the Palestinians who have been kidnapped by the IDF and by Israeli police been tortured while in custody?
Yeah, one of the things we've been doing at the gray zone, because we can't get in there into the Gaza Strip, no international reporters can, is working with reporters on the...
Da, deci, care e situația cu jurnalismul în Gaza? Dacă tu ești jurnalist, să spunem din România, și vrei să te duci în Gaza să vezi ce se întâmplă acolo, ai nevoie de aprobarea Israelului. De exemplu, chiar echipa CNN, la vreo 2 luni după declanșarea ororilor în fâșia Gaza, au primit acceptul Israelului pentru a da o scurtă incursiune acolo, însosiți de armata israeliană. Da? Și erau contra cronometru. Pentru că, precum ca cenușăreasa, la ora 6 seara trebuiau să se întoarcă tot cu escorta armată. Da? Altfel, jurnalist se mai face de acolo, gen au televiziuni precum Al Jazeera, corespondenți, da? Din fâșia Gaza, iau de dinainte de 7 octombrie, oamenii chiar locuiesc acolo, da? Și au legătura cu organul de presă la care sunt angajați sau cu care colaborează, numai că acești jurnaliști din interiorul Gaza au zilele numărate, da? Și sunt din ce în ce mai puțini, pentru că sunt, hai să folosesc termenul ăsta, targhetați de armata izraeliană, deoarece statului Israel nu-i convine să se afle adevărul, da? În imagini, da? Adevărul despre ororile comise în acea fâșiuță de pământ teribilă.
The ground who are covering these horrific events and publishing their work at our channel. I'm producing it. One event we covered was the return of something like 80 to 100 corpses to the Gaza Strip, to a cemetery in the southern city of Rafah. These were corpses of people whose bodies had been stolen by the Israeli military from, many of them had been stolen from the Shifa Hospital in the Gaza.
Spitalul al Shifa. Ok. Cel mai mare spital din Gaza, da? Acel spital despre care autoritățile israeliene ne-au spus că adăpostește sub el cel mai mare centru de comandă Hamas. Deci nu un centru de comandă Hamas, ci cel mai mare. Și că tuneluri, și că povești, și găseau ei calașnicoave ruginite pe acolo și așa mai departe. Lucruri care au fost recent, și folosesc chiar un englezism, debâncuite de cine? De publicația The Washington Post. Hei, publicația americană, care se pare că e mai înclinată să relateze adevărul din Gaza decât adevărul din Ucraina. Da? Deoarece, știți, una e să te răfuiești cu Putin și alta e să te răfuiești cu niște, scuzați-mi expresia, niște amărâți, desculți, încercați de tragedii nenumărate în viețile lor scurte.
In Gaza City, from other cemeteries, ostensibly because the Israelis were looking for their own hostages, but we have this history of Israeli organ theft, of the theft of body parts, which is well documented and
Ați auzit corect? Ați auzit corect. Furtul de organe.
admitted by, for example, Dr. Yehuda Hiss, an Israeli state pathologist at the
Da? Cu nume și prenume.
Abu Kabir Institute in Israel. There are reports, even by CNN, about this, dating back decades. Israel is an international center of the illegal organ trade. Israelis have been prosecuted in Israeli courts for this. And the Gaza Ministry of Health and Euromed Human Rights Monitor have alleged that these corpses, when they were returned to Israel to be buried in a mass grave, because there's no room left in the cemeteries, had body parts missing. I know personally
Ce le mai trebuiau? Organe. Da? Că erau reci.
the judge from knowing the family of Rachel Corrie, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer while
Da? Iarăși cu nume și prenume.
defending the home of a Palestinian friend of hers in the Gaza Strip in, I believe, 2003. They alleged that her parts of her body were taken by that very figure, that notorious figure, Dr. Yehuda Hiss, when her body was returned to her family. So there's a history of this that is very unsettling.
Chiar.
And how do they do this? I mean, do they bring the body to an Israeli morgue, and an Israeli mortician opens up the body and removes the organs, and then they bury the body in a mass grave?
Well, that's what the Gaza Ministry of Health is alleging. What Dr. Yehuda Hiss said was that we removed corneas and took organs and other body parts without the permission of the people who had been killed or their families. This included Palestinians who had been killed by Israeli security forces, people who were killed in road accidents, and even Israeli soldiers. Israel also has the largest skin bank in the world, and it uses that skin bank.
Deci cum Israelul, care este o țară mică, băi, cât în județ, da? Cu populație mică, are cea mai mare bancă de piele, pielea fiind și cel mai mare organ, da, al corpului. Dar cum așa? Păi, începem să pricepem cum așa. Da? Interesant.
To graft the skin of, for example, burn wounds that Israeli soldiers are enduring in the Gaza Strip as thousands are being wounded in this sort of faltering military assault on Gaza. The Israeli skin bank is accused of stealing body parts as well.
Da? Deci își diversifică activitatea, nu doar piele, ci și alte organe.
This is a crime against humanity that goes to the essence of Israel's assault on the personal freedom of Palestinians. That families don't even have the right to bury their own family members who are killed. And that's also part of the psychological war on Palestine, that Israel has traditionally sought to prevent the burials of Palestinians, especially those who they consider to be quote-unquote terrorists.
You reminded us at the outset of this program that you're not permitted in Gaza, and no international journalists are. But whatever sources you have for this, has this been exposed to the Israeli public? Is the Israeli public
Bănuiesc că da, și că pe publicul izraelian l-a durut în 14.
Aware of what the military and the Netanyahu administration is doing?
The Israeli public is not aware of the suffering of people in Gaza, and there was actually an exchange on an Israeli news program, a broadcast news program in Hebrew. I think it was Channel 13, one of the major networks there, where a journalist, older journalist from a more centrist or liberal position, said that people in Israel needed to understand how much suffering was taking place in Gaza because it was a catastrophe that would impact them as well. And a younger journalist who's more in line with Netanyahu, named Boker Almog, was brought on to basically shout down this senior reporter and tell him that he was compromising the war effort and basically serve as a organic military censor to prevent people from knowing. People also in Israel are not aware fully of how much their own military is suffering in the Gaza Strip. I think the number of casualties is being concealed, the number of injuries, the hideous injuries, and now we're hearing about a plague of suicides among Israeli soldiers who've come out of Gaza. In fact, some members of the Golani Brigade that were pulled out of northern Gaza were actually punished for attempting to speak to the bereaved mother of one of their company mates.
Tell me about the torture. What is to be gained by torturing Palestinian civilians other than the macabre, sadistic effort to punish people because of their ethnicity?
Well, when the Golani Brigade went into Israel, they chanted, went into Gaza before they went in, they chanted a song. Our motto is there are no uninvolved in Gaza. There are no civilians. And that's sort of the Israeli military doctrine.
Da? Am și eu pe canalul meu 2 clipuri despre câte un cântecel d-ăsta, cu intenții geno, pauză și dale. Da? Deci nu mă miră ce spune Max Blumenthal.
That everyone is Hamas.
Da? Și unul dintre cântece este culmea cântată de copii israelieni.
Everyone in Gaza is responsible. And with the failure of the Israeli military to kill the prime minister of Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, something that the Israeli defense minister promised would happen, with their failure to get any high-profile Hamas leaders and drag them out in front of the Israeli public or bomb their homes, they're just simply targeting civilians, taking hundreds of often old men and even children into a soccer stadium in Gaza.
Sau direct pe stradă, ați văzut și voi imaginile cu oamenii aceia în genunchi, fiind doar în lenjerie intimă, da?
Putting video out there on social media of them being humiliated, left shirtless in the cold, blindfolded, taken in trucks.
Nu doar fără cămașe, ci și fără pantaloni.
To an internment camp in southern Israel where they're then tortured. And we covered this at the Gray Zone with a Palestinian journalist. We actually got to interview some of the older men who are just working class guys in Gaza who were dumped back in the Gaza Strip after being taken to this camp for torture. They are presented to the Israeli public as actual Hamas militants because the Israeli military is unable to present a real military victory.
Doesn't the Israeli public see right through this, and don't they blame the government for torturing innocent people and lying to them about it?
Yeah, I don't think there's much sympathy there for any Palestinians within the Israeli public.
Ce v-am spus acum vreo 5 minute? Nu le pasă.
What is happening, however, is there have been a series of meetings with the families of Jews.
Ca să nu spun că susțin, da? Nu doar că nu le pasă. Sunt de acord. Chiar a existat un sondaj de opinie printre izraelieni, singura democrație din Orientul Mijlociu, așa, de parcă apartheidul ar putea fi o democrație, și 60% dintre respondenți, da, dintre izraelieni, au spus că armata izraeliană ar trebui să se comporte chiar mai brutal decât se comportă acum, da? Cu palestinienii.
Jewish Israeli hostages who are still in Gaza. There are more than 100 of them. and Netanyahu, and they're screaming at Netanyahu. They're demanding that he roll back this military operation and negotiate, because they realize that the only way they're going to get their loved ones back is through an actual deal. And Netanyahu is determined.
Da? Fapt concret. După mai bine de 2 luni de operațiuni, să le spunem operațiuni, armata izraeliană n-a reușit să recupereze nici măcar un singur obstacol. Da? Deci să recupereze prin acțiune. Ar fi putut recupera 3, numai că armata izraeliană i-a împușcat, în ciuda faptului că aceștia erau fără cămașă, cu mâinile sus și rugându-i în ebraică să îi recupereze, să nu îi omoare. Numai că
determined to avoid that deal because the ceasefire.
Aproape de neînțeles. Da, probabil că ăsta este antrenamentul, probabil că vor fi unii care nu sunt tocmai întregi la cap, care vor să se întoarcă din fâșia Gaza, lăudându-se cu, cum să spun, cu un răboj, mă înțelegeți ce spun, da? Și trag în tot ce mișcă. S-a întâmplat să tragă în israelieni. În loc să-i recupereze, i-au recuperat definitiv, da? Ca să spun așa.
Fire means the end of his political career and the end of his extremely right-wing coalition. So there is mounting opposition. Netanyahu actually went into a meeting today with the Minister of Defense, the War Cabinet, without the intelligence chiefs because he's increasingly afraid of scrutiny. We're seeing a war of the mandarins within the Israeli body politic, where the intense pressure on Netanyahu is ratcheting up as he is failing to bring the hostages back.
Is he actually afraid of Mossad
Să-i aducă înapoi, nu în spate.
and Shin Bet?
Well, these are the so-called gatekeepers, and the former Mossad and Shin Bet chiefs, appeared in a film, for example, a documentary called The Gatekeepers, where they were attacking Netanyahu and the religious nationalist direction of the Israeli government. And they're increasingly coming out and saying, for example, former Israeli Army Chief of Staff Dan Halutz, who helped oversee some of the first heavy aircraft assaults on the Gaza Strip in history, has said that the war is lost to Hamas and that the real victory will only come when Netanyahu is removed. You have Giora Eland, who is a former major general, who's now a major military commentator in Israel. He has said that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza has proved resilient and cannot be simply defeated. So all these acknowledgements are taking place. Every major central.
Da? Pe undeva putem înțelege de ce ăștia, palestinienii, hai să le spunem direct, militanții Hamas, se pregătesc o viață pentru astfel de situații. Da? Nu sunt clasa de mijloc obișnuită, îmbuibată, da? Obișnuită cu confortul. Nu. Ăștia sunt cumva născuți pentru a lupta și din fragedă copilărie cumva își acceptă eventualul, cum spuneai, eventuala martirizare. Da? Cred că asta este expresia. Nu că ar fi ei niște oameni mai altfel decât noi, ci pur și simplu așa se întâmplă într-o societate supusă oprimării. Da? Se întărește, se bătătorește, se radicalizează și știți până la urmă expresia românească, fiecare culege ce a semănat, fiecare doarme după cum își așterne, încă o expresie, vedeți?
This columnist in Israel has said that there will be no military solution in Gaza and that Netanyahu is the problem, but Netanyahu's there. He has a solid base and he himself is a prisoner to these extreme figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who hold just a few seats in the Israeli Knesset.
No.
But if they leave his whole coalition falls apart. He leaves power and he goes back to trial for all the corruption charges he faces.
I guess he would also be indicted for incompetence as well, malfeasance in office. But
on October 7th, for sure. I mean, so more men have to be thrown into the meat grinder in Gaza in order to keep Netanyahu's political career alive. I think that is starting to dawn on Israel, along with the
Parcă am mai auzit asta undeva. Unde oare? Da, undeva prin vecini.
fact that they're taking losses on the northern border. And as former Israeli minister in a Netanyahu coalition, Avigdor Lieberman, pointed out today, angrily aimed at Netanyahu, 200,000 Israelis are internally displaced because they can't go back home in the south or the north because the military campaign is not achieving its objectives.
What was the torture that was visited on the Palestinian civilians? Do you know?
Well, they're coming back and alleging everything from being handcuffed for days and days on end, being beaten. Euromed Human Rights Monitor and the Israeli newspaper Haaretz have documented numerous deaths. They were beaten to death. Some have now alleged that they were given hallucinogenic drugs in order to force them into confession. And we've seen the head of the Rantisi Pediatric Hospital, which had the only pediatric oncology ward in Gaza. He was captured by Israel, and they induced a confession in which he claimed that he was Hamas in order to justify Israel's destruction of most of the medical facilities in northern Gaza. So, of course, that came through torture. Why else would he say it? So one older man we interviewed said that they would say anything just to stop their beatings.
How bad is the famine
Doamne ferește.
and the disease in Gaza as we speak because of what the IDF has done?
There's one Twitter account I follow of a woman who's still in northern Gaza who writes in English. Her name is Iman Basher, Basher. Everyone should follow her.
Da? Deci, jurnalismul ad hoc din fâșia Gaza, cel pe care statul Israel nu poate să-l oprească sau, mă rog, încearcă să-l oprească și înțelegeți prin ce metode. Da?
Her children there, and she said they have lost almost half their weight. She has young children.
Da? Dacă nu ați priceput, vă mai spun eu o dată, copiii acelei jurnaliste, probabil independente, au slăbit până au ajuns la jumătatea greutății pe care o aveau înainte de 7 octombrie. Foamete.
Children. She said, I hope you all are enjoying watching my children starve to death. Because
Se topesc, da? Ați văzut și secvențe din lagărele de concentrare, da? Din anii 40. Ok.
no aid is reaching northern Gaza.
Deci vă puteți imagina cam cum este.
Famine is spreading in the camps in southern Gaza. So only a few aid trucks are able to enter from Egypt. And at the final checkpoint before these trucks go in, they're checked by the Israelis.
Nu știu de ce a sucombat subtitrarea, da? Spune că puținele ajutoare care avansează spre Gaza sunt gestionate de Israel, da? Care are ultimul cuvânt. Intră, nu intră.
Kerem Shalom, which is an Israeli checkpoint. So Israel has total control over everything that goes in Gaza. And according to one medical professional I spoke to, they're taking the anesthetic out. Over 1,000 children, according to UNICEF, in the Gaza Strip have received amputations of their limbs without anesthetic. It's not hard to find.
Da? Peste 1000 de copii au suferit amputații, bănuiți din ce motive, fără anestezie. Înțelegeți din ce motive fără anestezie.
Find videos of that taking place on Twitter. I watched one, unfortunately, of a child reciting the Quran as they were having a limb amputated without anesthetic. Just imagine your own child being subjected to that.
It is unimaginable. The New York Times has published a piece claiming that on October 7th, there's evidence of rape and beheading. You have debunked that. You have just obliterated that. Why would the Times do it? And what was the Times' so-called information even based on?
Well, this is a high-level Israeli psychological operation and a propaganda hoax that only became coherent about 2 months after October 7th, when
Deci, ca să ne înțelegem, au fost eliberați niște ostateci, da? În perioada aia de câteva zile de încetare a focului și au fost eliberați femei și copii. Nici o singură femeie, nici măcar una, niciuna, nu a spus că ar fi suferit agresiuni sexuale.
Israel decided that international
În tot timpul ăla pe care l-au stat acolo în Gaza, nimic. Da? Ce să mai vorbim de alea câteva ore, da, când s-a întâmplat iureșul ăla sau ce a fost el, vă dați seama că atunci chiar că nu exista nici timpul fizic necesar pentru astfel de orori.
support for its genocidal rampage in Gaza was faltering, and that they were particularly losing support among Joe Biden's base, which includes many feminists, progressive-minded people. And so they began to accuse Hamas of mass rape without any forensic evidence. And that's the first thing the New York Times piece by Jeffrey Gettleman, who is guilty of the worst journalistic malpractice, as we just outlined at our live stream at the Gray Zone, and I did so on Twitter and will continue to do. They blame the lack of forensic evidence, the total lack of forensic evidence proving these allegations, on Jewish burial ritual. So basically, if you challenge any of this or ask for evidence, you're anti-Semitic. Then they proceed to interview all these witnesses. One guy, Raz Cohen, who's a former Special Forces soldier who was at the Nova Electronic Music Festival, who claimed to have seen Hamas militants get out of a white van and gang rape a woman in the middle of their lightning surprise attack on Israel. And this is a guy who has changed his story, as I've documented, no less than 8 times.
Wow.
And when he was interviewed on October 9th, first interviewed, he made no statements about having witnessed any rape. Then you have this anonymous paramedic that the New York Times interviews, who has previously gone on an Indian news channel and lied about finding a dead Israeli baby thrown in a trash can by Hamas militants and stabbed multiple times. There's no record of that. He's just a fraud. I could go on, but from top to bottom, this story is an elaborate fraud based on the perception that anyone involved with Hamas is capable of sexual savagery as soon as they come upon a Jewish Israeli woman, which is interesting because if you listen to the testimonies of the young women who have come out of the Gaza Strip where they were held in captivity, none of them describe any sexual abuse. In fact,
de fapt, chiar cred că ieri sau ceva am auzit o știre mai degrabă cu aspect de cancan, dar treaba era serioasă, despre o femeie izraeliană ținută captivă de Hamas, da, în Gaza și eliberată în cadrul schimbului de prizonieri, da, acela din intervalul ăla de câteva zile când s-a oprit focul în Gaza. Și știrea era ceva de genul că își tatuase pe mână data de 7 octombrie și mai spuneau despre ea că a devenit un fel de vedetă locală, deci prin Israel, și privind imagine am putut să înțeleg de ce. Femeia era de o frumusețe răpitoare, da? Deci o tipă de aia blondă, cu ochii azurii, cu tot ce trebuie, unde trebuie. Și nici ea nu a suferit niciun apropo de natură sexuală, da, conform propriilor relatări, ba chiar a povestit că a fost șocată de faptul că a fost găzduită, mă rog, că dacă se poate folosi acest termen atunci când ești ostatic, de o familie și îngrijită de o femeie și ținută printre copiii acelei femei palestiniene.
One said that she was shocked at how careful her captors were to not make her feel uncomfortable in any way or violated in any way. That's not to say that, everything Hamas did was
of course.
That they didn't kill people, they didn't kill civilians.
Da,
But
au ucis și civili, într-adevăr.
Israel has to go big with its propaganda to justify its big genocide.
And Max, the propaganda has been a failure. Is there any country on the planet besides the United States of America whose government buys this?
No, I mean, the majority of American
Al cărui guvern, da, crede asta, da, așa este expresia în englez, buy this, da?
are in favor of a ceasefire and consider the amount of propaganda they're subjected to by legacy media. They're still able to see through it.
Legacy media, ce frumos a zis.
Uh,
Mainstream media.
It's amazing how Biden's empire of lies has just completely collapsed. This is a major contributing factor in his historic unpopularity heading into a re-election. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the site of the 1968 Richard Daley police riot, is going to be a disaster. This assault on Gaza is Vietnam for the young progressive activist between age 18 and 25, and Biden is going to pay a heavy price, as he should.
Așa cum a spus și stafful TikTok, da? Populația tânără susține Palestina.
Has the IDF intentionally murdered journalists in Gaza?
Absolutely.
Vreo 100, nu? Peste 100.
We have one of the most famous journalists in Gaza, who's a revered figure. His name is Wael Dahdouh. He's still alive. His cameraman was deliberately targeted by Israel and killed as they tried to cover an Israeli attack on a UN school where civilians were sheltering. He was killed in a drone strike. Dahdouh was injured. But previously in October, Dahdouh's entire family, his son, his daughter, his grandchild, his wife, they were killed in a targeted strike.
Incredibil. Incredibil. Bă, tupeul cu care comit aceste crime în plină zi e ceva de Doamne ferește.
A targeted strike on their home. This was a deliberate attack because Dahdouh is a famous Al Jazeera journalist and an Israeli military analyst. His name is Yehezekeli. Yehuda Yechazeli, I believe his name is. He's a famous military analyst. He went on Channel 13 that night and declared that Dahdouh was killed by Israel, was targeted by Israel because they hated his reporting. It wasn't just his opinion. He was claiming confirmation based on military sources. And this has happened again and again to Palestinian journalists in Gaza, where they've been killed, not just in the field, but at home, along with their entire families. And Tony Blinken goes out today and laments the loss of so many journalists around the world who are reporting conflict. That's blood on Tony Blinken's hands. He's lamenting his own crimes.
And what will it take for the Israeli public to recognize the barbarity of the government? All these examples that you've given us, the lies of the government, the secrets of the government. Wouldn't the Israeli public be outraged if they knew or had enough evidence to believe what you've been reporting?
Well, just a quick correction that came to mind so everyone can Google it or search for it on Twitter. It's Zvi Yechazeli who made that statement about the Palestinian journalists. I don't believe the Israeli public will at any point have a change of heart about this genocidal rampage in Gaza. It is one of the most indoctrinated publics on the planet because of full conscription in the military. There will be other factors brought to bear that...
Da? Deci, ca să explicăm așa, dacă se spune despre palestinieni că își cresc copiii pentru luptă, ce credeți că fac opozanților, care au și ei copii? Da?
Will force them into some kind of that may force them to pull back. Unfortunately, if the United States is not one of those factors, it's going to be military force from elements like Hezbollah or economic force, which we're seeing as the de facto government of Yemen closes off one of the key economic choke points at Bab al-Mandeb in the Red Sea on Israel. It's been a very effective method of putting pressure on Israel with minimum military force.
How is the Israeli economy with the 350,000 draft age men, reservists ordered for active duty, and with obviously no Palestinians able to work in menial jobs? How has this affected the economy?
Da? Deci, palestinienii, da, cumva izraelienii se lăudau, uitați-vă, le dăm de muncă. Da, muncesc în Israel. Taximetriști, chestii de-astea. Da? Bun.
That's a great question. You're seeing a lot of these reservists who've been in the field for 2 months or more, who are small businessmen, actually losing their small business and starting to ask for donations, crowdfunding to maintain their houses. They're going before Knesset and complaining that they're being reduced to poverty. So this is another pressure point on Netanyahu and the war cabinet. Yes, cheap Palestinian labor is no longer available, which is hurting the economy. And the Israeli finance ministry has announced that it's basically back in COVID mode in handing out aid to Israeli citizens, tapping all their strategic financial reserves to basically pay people to stay in Israel, because so many Israelis who can leave are leaving. You have the southern city of Sderot, which came under attack on October 7th. No one can move back there, so the Israeli government is having to pay for hotel rooms and welfare for everyone in a relatively sizable Israeli city, people who are already fairly poor. So this is taking an economic toll on a society which is accustomed to a more middle-class lifestyle, unlike the population of, for example, southern Lebanon or the Gaza Strip, where there is sort of a ethos of steadfastness and resistance.
Da?
Have you seen
Cum v-am explicat și eu diferența dintre cele două populații. Unii sunt mai bătătoriți pentru că au suferit mai mult. Cam asta a fost pentru astăzi. Mulțumesc celor care au vizionat videoclipul până în acest moment. Nu uitați de like, vă aștept la comentarii și mulțumiri speciale celor care mă susțin pe Patreon sau din postura de membri ai canalului Noaptea Minții.